Greetings, Culture Warriors. It is I, Jeff Vieira, the author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest dispatch from the front. News story for you today from the Air Force Times. This is by, I don't see a name on it. Be a Bro. How a commander's sexism derailed this pilot training class and brought down AETC leaders. There are two types of women who fly in combat air forces, a female student pilot was told by her flight commander in early 2018. First, there are the bros, female pilots who have tough skin and simply shrug off offensive comments, the flight commander told her during a midterm feedback session after her check ride in a T-38. These women are more likely to be chosen for leadership positions, he said. Then there are the women who are easily offended, he said, according to her responses to a May 1st, 2018 commander-directed investigation into harassment, sexual misconduct, hazing, and other misconduct in the 87th Flying Training Squadron, part of the 47th Flying Training Wing at Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas. Their future opportunities would be limited, he implied. One thing that didn't factor into his calculus, he told her, flying ability. Her heart sank as she listened to her superior officer rattle off stereotypes about female pilots. It wasn't the first time she had experienced sexism while learning to fly in the 87th, and it wouldn't be the last. The investigation, obtained by the Air Force Times through the Freedom of Information Act, provides more context to the misconduct and leadership failures that led to the abrupt firing of 3 commanders in October 2018, including the former wing commander of the 47th. But it also shows how an undergraduate pilot training flight's culture can deteriorate under the command of an officer who made what investigators call sexist remarks, demeaned female pilots, and allowed an atmosphere of sexism to fester. It also provides a glimpse of the challenges women can face while trying to break into the heavily male-dominated world of Air Force pilots. An environment that goes wrong, the report shows, can lead to a promising female aviator feeling like they have to stay silent and endure sexual harassment to avoid derailing their careers. In a statement provided to the Air Force Times, Major General Craig Wills, commander of the 19th Air Force that oversees flying training, said harassment in any form or actions that degrade or marginalize anyone is unacceptable in his command or the Air Force. AETC and 19th Air Force are committed to fostering a climate where every airman feels welcome, valued, and included, Wills said. Every flying instructor in AETC is held to a high standard. Wills said that to make sure problems like the harassment in the 87th doesn't happen again, the 19th has improved its training and increased reporting requirements. It also continues to hold commanders accountable for their unit climate and their airmen's health and success. While the vast majority of our instructor force is setting an excellent example, we will deal swiftly and firmly with any reports of conduct that fails to match our standards, Wills says. We owe our airmen, family members, and citizens an Air Force that exemplifies our national aspirations and ideals. The Air Force has grown increasingly concerned in recent years about the lack of diversity in its pilot corps and has sought to try to remove barriers that prevent or discourage women and minorities from trying to become pilots. Last year, the service said only 6% of its pilots were women. In October 2018, now retired Lieutenant General Stephen Quast, former head of Air Education and Training Command, announced the firings within the 47th in the wake of multiple investigations into misconduct. AETC also released another heavily redacted report in December 2018 that outlined the failures of an absentee leadership that did not correct unsafe situations and fostered both a disrespectful treatment of some students and a booze-soaked culture gone awry. In early November 2018, AETC said the misconduct included a vulgar and sexist call sign that was given to a female student pilot. That student's experiences in the 87th were the subject of the investigation obtained by the Air Force Times. But even beyond the call sign, that student entered a pattern of sexist behavior while learning to fly. The commander of her flight, called Mother Flight, was often the one making the inappropriate comments or allowing them to be made without intervening to stop them. The call sign incident happened in November 2017 during a traditional naming party following the student pilot's first solo flights. Instructor pilots were there to preemptively reject or change suggested call signs. The students voted on potential call signs by cheering the loudest for the one they liked, while the pilot was being named was out of the room. When the female student was brought back in and told the call signs they had chosen for her, the second dropped a single letter from the vulgar one. She didn't raise an objection, the report said. She told the others she did not feel offended by either call sign, but it was apparent to many in attendance that she was not content with her assigned call sign. She was one of just 2 women in the class and in the room at the time, AATC said. Afterward, the flight commander, who was present during the naming party and acted as the mayor running the roll call style event, told the student pilot he was glad she received the most vulgar call sign, according to the report. He implied he was happy she was not offended by it. It was also the only time she could recall anyone actually calling her to her face the most vulgar version of the call sign, according to the report. Others stuck to the slightly cleaned up version. This constituted harassment, investigators concluded. Although other students were the ones who chose the vulgar call sign, the flight commander and other instructors stayed silent and allowed it, both by refusing to veto it before the vote and by not nixing it after it was selected. This, investigators concluded, led to an environment where harassment was understood to be acceptable. It didn't matter that the female student said she didn't take offense to it, the report said, as any reasonable person would conclude it was offensive and it was clear she was not okay with it. The report describes a tense atmosphere in the midterm feedback session that took place in early 2018, in the wake of the naming party. The flight commander made comments beyond the scope of what normally would be said to a student in a standard feedback session, the report said, as well as making those comments in front of the new assistant flight commander. He told her he was very concerned when he found out there was a female in the flight room while he was flight commander, the report said. This surprised and worried the student, the report said. It seemed to her that he viewed her presence there in a negative light. Even more worrying to her, the flight commander held a great deal of sway over the rankings of student assignments and controlled 20% of her final score. The future of her career was in his hands. When she asked why he felt this way, he laid out his theory that female bros were more likely to be chosen for leadership positions than the easily offended, regardless of flying ability, the report said. She was troubled, the report said, and her perception of him had become tainted. She started to worry that he might treat her differently because of these views. The investigators said the flight commander's comments reinforced her belief that she had to stay quiet and endure the offensive call sign. It furthered the intimidating and offensive environment by suggesting that if she wanted to perform well in pilot training and score well, that she had to continue to acquiesce to the environment she created and continue to be a bro. The report laid out other instances in which the student pilot felt interactions with the flight commander were inappropriate and worsened her concerns about her future opportunities. One such conversation had to do with her chances of becoming a first assignment instructor pilot, or FAIP. The Air Force only has a small number of coveted FAIP positions available in which new pilots graduate from undergraduate pilot training and immediately become instructor pilots. But about 2 months after the midterm feedback session, the flight commander told the female student, "I can't FAIP you," the report said. She was confused, and when she asked why, he said he didn't want people to think he was showing favoritism toward her by choosing her for an instructor job in the 87th. Another flight commander, he said, had recently chosen a female student for a FAIP position, and rumors spread that he had feelings for her. If the flight commander chose this student pilot for the same desired job, he was concerned he would get the same reputation, the report said. She began to worry more about her career, the report said, and thought about talking to leadership about her concerns. A few days later, though, the flight commander admitted to her he was wrong to say he couldn't choose her for a FAIP assignment. He told her she would be a great addition to the 87th if she was chosen. He even promised to rack and stack all the students by their merit assignment selection system scores and go down the list fairly, though the report said this ended up not happening. In another instance, while taxiing back with the student pilot after a training sortie, the flight commander suddenly said that he thought he saw her making out with an instructor pilot from another base at a bar a month or two earlier. The student pilot said she was dumbfounded and didn't know what he was talking about. Even more, she was shocked he would not only say such a thing to a student, but that he had said it in an aircraft on a student sortie. Other instructor pilots raised concerns to investigators about the flight commander's intense personality and leadership style. Some said he would verbally berate anyone who disagreed with him, and instructors repeatedly cited incidents where they saw him loudly and unprofessionally arguing with other instructors, even in front of students. Several said he was focused on maintaining appearances. The flight commander tried to develop a fighter pilot culture in Mother Flight, the report said. Even though he was a C-17 pilot from Air Mobility Command who lacked experience with that culture. His view of stereotypical fighter pilot culture, which consists primarily of his own specialized UPT experience, meshes well with the students' expectations of what a fighter community does, the report said. The longer a student knew him, the more they liked him. Conversely, the longer an instructor knew him, the less they liked him. One student described the flight commander's reaction to the offensive call sign at the naming party as being like Caesar appeasing the commoners, the report said. Doing just enough to feel as though he had control, but mostly caring about staying in the students' good graces. In a withering broadside that concluded the flight commander was derelict in his duties, the report said his desire to earn students' appreciation led directly to him ignoring a glaring case of harassment and sexual harassment during the naming party. The flight commander failed in his duty as an officer and a leader by letting his sexist personal opinions cloud his judgment and directly related to the hostile and offensive environment that the student pilot had to deal with for 6 months of Phase 3 training, the report said. The investigation also concluded the flight commander's conduct was unbecoming of an officer and a gentleman in violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. AETC provided a list of changes that have already been put in place or in the works across the 19th Air Force to ensure flying students don't encounter harassment. At Laughlin, AETC officials said, instructor pilots must take a 5-part course on professional relationships, emphasizing how to build a professional instructor-student relationship and the importance of building diverse and inclusive learning environments. The operations group commander at Laughlin also set up a private line students could use to anonymously report discomfort or dissatisfaction with their training experience, and the 87th, in particular, significantly increased its percentage of female instructor pilots, AET said. These female instructors are exceptional leaders and great mentors to incoming female student pilots, AET said. ATC and the 19th Air Force has worked to ensure an inclusive, healthy climate in all of our flying training units, including by increasing staff's focus on sexual harassment problems. The 19th began using a standardized flight commander course for all instructors, AET said. It placed first sergeants and squadron superintendents in each flying training squadron, to advise commanders and help work on issues with new officers. ATC prohibited gifts between students and instructors that could contribute to unprofessional actions and expectations. It also included sexual assault and prevention training into squadron commander courses. ATC is also still working on adding an ethics training course for instructor pilots, which includes scenarios called What Now IP. It is setting up a diversity and inclusion task force working on improving representation in undergraduate aviation training classes and developing new feedback mechanisms to let students report concerns in real time. It is considering setting up an app-based system to help evaluate how effective training is and how healthy the unit climate is. ATC is also considering whether to add a dedicated student advocate to underground training programs similar to the Military and Family Life Counseling Program, who would be a voice for the students and improve communication and trust between instructors and students. All right, that's a lengthy article with a lot of detail. Those of you who are not in the Air Force may have missed kind of some key points in that article, but I thought it was important to go through the whole thing for the commentary that is going to ensue. So here on the podcast, what we do is we take stories like these and then we look at it through the lens of culture and values and analyze it that way. So a couple of points I want to make, especially for those not familiar with the Air Force, is that in the Air Force, there is a belief that is deeply held within the culture, and that is that future generals are made by the rank of captain. The Air Force is a flying service. And so in the hierarchy of the Air Force, it is the pilot who is on top of the heap. Unlike the other services, the pilots are officers, all of them, and they are the folks who do the fighting. So you have some limited amount of engagement, say, within the security police. But realistically, when the balloon goes up, it is an Air Force officer who will be doing the fighting for the service. And so they are on the top of the heap. Within the pilot community, the very top of the heap is probably the test pilot. that is a subset of fighter pilot. So the way it works in the Air Force is if you have dreams of being the Air Force Chief of Staff, the highest rank in the Air Force, then one day, so you're going to have to follow a cursus honorum. That's a Latin term. It's the way that the high muckety mucks of the Roman Empire used to advance. But you have to follow this course in your career if you're going to get to the top. And that course looks something like this. First, you have to, in whatever cadet program you're in, whether it's through the Air Force Academy or through ROTC, or through, say, officer training school, you will need to finish near the top of your class. Once you're near the top of your class, you need to qualify for pilot training. Once you get to pilot training, you must finish in the top of your class at pilot training so that you can get your choice of aircraft. Once you get your choice of aircraft, you choose a fighter. You go through to your first training in your fighter, and then you try and qualify for another. If you get two under your belt, two top-line fighters under your belt, you can qualify to be an expert pilot that will allow you to basically go become a test pilot. And then from there, some test pilots go on to become astronauts and go work for NASA, but the ones who stick around in the Air Force are looking to advance from that point forward by taking over various commands within fighter wings and proceeding on that basis. So you'll notice that in that mix, you don't see a lot of, well, what about becoming a combat fighter pilot and doing a lot of hours and, dropping a lot of bombs and shooting down enemy aircraft? What about that? Well, that doesn't really factor in that much. It could be helpful, but the bottom line of it is just by virtue of your having done that, then when you're a junior officer, you will get recognized by the higher-ups at the club who will tap you for future stardom. And then it all falls from there. You'll get the best assignments. You'll get the best commands. You'll do a couple of rotations through the Pentagon and check some boxes there. And then it'll put you in the best possible position when, as a major and beyond, you start coming up for promotion boards. And then they look at your jacket. They see that you check all the right boxes, and they promote you, and so on, and so on, and so on, until you become a general. So that cursus honorum within the Air Force is the path that they're talking about. So when someone says they were worried about their career, they're not talking about worrying about, staying in the Air Force, being able to make it to 20 or what have you. They're worried about being able to stay on the golden path. Now, some pilots just want to fly the plane. And so as far as they're concerned, as long as they want to stay in the service as long as they can, flying planes as long as they can, and that's fine. But the more ambitious among them know they're only going to fly planes for a while, and then they're going to take over large units, and eventually they're going to transition into a role where they set the budget for the service, and that's the real key to the power of it. So when you look at the culture at these UPT bases, you're dealing with super competitive people who know that if they want to realize their dream, they're going to have to win against their classmates. That's the environment that they're in. So it shouldn't be a surprise that some commanders in that environment try to add on additional requirements beyond being able to fly your plane. They want to add all sorts of things in there to see if you're really someone who ought to be tapped. At the time you're going through pilot training, most of these folks are lieutenants, second lieutenants, maybe first lieutenant. Okay, so they hit captain usually about the 4-year point. And by the time they hit captain and they're in those assignments, that's when they're going to be determined if they have high potential in the terms of the service there. So it's vitally important for them to do well at UPT and to do well when they get to their first active Air Force assignment. And so it's a big threat in UPT to not grade them out towards the top of their class. It could really end the dream for many of them. So that's the situation that this woman kind of found herself in. Now, the other thing to consider is that there is a culture within the Air Force, as noted, of what I like to refer to as the exalted fighter pilot, where there is a tendency to kind of harken back to the to an imaginary era of the Air Force where men were men and sheep were scared. You know, we used to refer to in the academy as the brown shoe days. You know, so the Air Force itself came from the Army. When it started, they had Army uniforms, and those Army uniforms had brown shoes. They were wearing khakis and brown shoes. And then as the Air Force became its own thing, we transitioned over to wearing Air Force blue and black shoes. So when you want to talk real old school Air Force stuff, you refer to the brown shoe days. And there's a conception of that heavily male-dominated, smoke-filled, bear-guzzling environment where this kind of stuff went on all the time. Now, that never really existed. You know, the closest it may have come was for a period in Vietnam, but even then, by all accounts, there was a professionalism that still reigned overall. And so for somebody who didn't come up in that environment and is trying to recreate it, they get some strange notions of what it was and what it should be, and those notions have nothing at all to do with the primary mission that they're trying to fulfill. In this case, it's to teach people how to safely fly aircraft. And secondarily, to weed out anyone who's not really good pilot material. So really, flying ability should be the primary thing that you're concerned with as an instructor pilot and as a commander of instructor pilots in this situation. Clearly, that wasn't the case with this person. He was more interested in maintaining a phony culture. Now, as I bring up in the book, culture emanates from leadership. That is the only place it comes from. And so when you have someone who has rather twisted ideas of culture, then you're going to wind up with a twisted culture. Culture also is to serve the purpose of the organization. So in this case, the organization is to produce the best pilots. That's the purpose of it. This culture that this person tried to create was not about that. And it hurt the unit, and it hurt the mission. And for that class that graduated, one has to wonder if they got the best training possible. Back when I was in the 90s, we were just starting to bring women into combat roles within the Navy and within the Air Force and open up the ranks of the exalted fighter pilots to women. And it was very controversial at the time for a couple of reasons. One is there was a long-standing military tradition in the United States military that women do not serve in combat roles. In the Air Force in particular, there is a reason for this. When we went through SERE training, which is Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape, they did a POW simulation. Because if your aircraft gets shot down, chances are you're over enemy territory. There's a likelihood that you will be captured. And if you're captured, they tend to take you back to one of their prisons, interrogate you, and try and get what you know out of you, try and turn you over to propaganda purposes, etc. What they found was that the presence of women in this situation really undermined the ability of men to resist. And the reason for that was simple. It was because men are taught from birth, particularly in America, to protect women. And so all they had to do was threaten to harm a woman in some way. And men found it very hard to override their innate programming to find any way possible to defend her. And this led to the horns of a dilemma. What do you do? Do you keep women out of that situation as best you can? Well, obviously, if they're fighter pilots, then bomber pilots flying over a battlefield, missiles don't discriminate, right? That's going to be impossible to do. The other side of it was to desensitize men, to use the training to make them indifferent to the suffering of their fellow pilots, in this case, female pilots. Well, that's got consequences of a different sort. Do you really want to teach men not to, not to be protective of women? Probably not the best thing, but you can see what their line of thinking was. And I think that's where some of the notion of bro culture kind of comes from. They also had problems in that in order to get great headlines and great press for the service, they often did not give these women, these early pioneers, the best training possible. And they didn't wash them out when they deserved to be washed out. One Navy pilot, Kara Hultgren, lost her life because she wasn't ready to do carrier landings on the plane. It is believed that what happened was, as they ran into trouble on a landing, she panicked and didn't hit her ejection seat on time. So what happened was the second person in her aircraft did hit the ejection seat, popped out, lived. But by the time it automatically popped hers, the aircraft was facing down and it drove her to the bottom of the ocean. A terrible end for a young woman who aspired to be a naval aviator. But her leadership was largely to blame because they tried to rush her through the training. It does no good to claim a first if the person isn't ready. It's a disservice to them. And in this case, it was a fatal disservice. Those kind of stories were legion in the early years where women were being integrated into combat units. There was an uneasy agreement that standards should not be lowered for this reason. And so a couple of things happen. You start getting better female candidates for this kind of training because they're better prepared. And you have the opportunity to make sure that their training is at the same levels that everyone else's is. So you get a great product out of that training. Now, there was always some resentment because throughout this period, pilot slots were hard to come by. The Air Force and the Navy were in drawdowns through most of the 90s. Periodically, you'll hear news that they're drawing down this service or that service as warfare kind of ebbs and flows. And so those spots are highly sought after. And there's a concern that if you put somebody into one of those slots for any reason other than their potential to be a great pilot, you're leaving something on the table. That leads to resentment and it leads to questions with regard to your fellow pilots. So they engage in behaviors that are really deleterious to group morale. When she joined that unit, she was an outsider, not an insider. She was asked to swallow things that she should not be asked to swallow, such as vulgar call signs. A call sign is what someone calls you over the radio. They don't use your real name. So if you get stuck with a negative call sign, you're going to live with that for the rest of your Air Force career. You're going to hear it every day, many times a day. And so if you're forced to deal with a less than flattering call sign, well, it's going to be a miserable experience for you. And sometimes, bros being bros, they gang up to make sure you get stuck with a crappy call sign. Not because of anything you did, but because you're not one of them. That's what seems to have happened in this case. It's a way that they fight back against the politically correct stuff that's been forced down their throats. But again, it's not the fault of the women who are going through training. In my experience, women who are in these male-dominated units genuinely want to be part of the team. They're not there to make waves. They're not there to make trouble. They're not there to be tokens. They're there because they have the same aim that the men in the unit do. They're there to serve their country. They're there to fly, fight, and win. But that gets lost because of the political toxicity around how they get there. And so that also leads to them being very sensitive to things that are not said outright. So you go into your midterm review and you start to hear little signals being given by the commander that you're not one of us. And you better straighten up. And you better not make waves. As this woman did. It's all part of that same toxic culture. The culture fails to realize that the purpose of that particular organization is to produce great fighter pilots, great pilots, great cargo pilots, great bomber pilots, great fighter pilots, great whatever. And so because of this commander and because some of the external politics, you wind up with this. But the other thing that should be noted is none of these commands operate on their own. They're all part of a larger organization. So when you see them pounding on one flight commander, you're seeing a different aspect of Air Force culture in play. When you see that in response to this, they start flooding the zone with a bunch of policies and a bunch of training. You know, being a quality professional for the past 25 or so years, one of the things that I've developed a deep aversion to is claiming that training, lack of training, is a root cause of anything. It generally isn't. But it is a good fig leaf because then you can say, hey, we gave them the training. The problem is solved. And by the time anyone checks on it, you'll be further down the path. You can say you covered your butt because you gave training, and then if something happens down the road, it's obviously because the training wore off and you give them more training. It's a cowardly way to avoid dealing with a real problem. And it's really not that this particular weirdo flight commander was at fault, but where was his commander? Where was his boss? Why was his boss not conversant enough with what was going on in that class to know this was coming? The signs are pretty obvious, but his boss gets let off the hook, and I'll tell you why his boss got let off the hook in all likelihood. It was probably because he was anointed back when he was a captain as a high potential. And in the Air Force, the high potentials get protected, the wagons get circled around them, and everybody else gets the full course of military justice. So what the Air Force does when one of these embarrassing situations arises is they build a 3-ring fence around it, and they fire the lowest ranking person they possibly can, and if that flies, they don't fire anybody else. It doesn't hurt anybody else. They just say, we had a bad apple, and that was the end of it. It's a complete dereliction of duty on the part of the higher ranking officers, whose job it is to know what kind of command environments their junior officers are producing. That's supposed to be how they're evaluated. And so as I read this story, you can clearly see the 3-card Monte game that's being played by the higher-ups, who don't even get mentioned in the article. Now, why do you think their names were not included in the article? And I'll tell you why. It is because they were the source for much of the material in the article. So they said it was a Freedom of Information Act. That's no doubt true. Their names were in all those documents. And so when you see that these folks are being mentioned, and they basically just give pat answers, pat quotes to this, that tells you that they provided inside information to the article, and their appearance is simply to kind of absolve them of any wrongdoing in the article. So when you have things here like what Wills said, while the vast majority of our instructor force is setting an excellent example, we'll deal swiftly and firmly with any reports of conduct that fails to match our standards. That's just bureaucratese. It means nothing. And so he's given the opportunity to spout off about nothing. But the real question is, all right, how are you going to ensure that the mission focus is the primary focus of these organizations, and that this bro culture is not put in place of what these future Air Force warriors are supposed to be doing? And you'll get no answer on that because they have no intention of doing anything at all about it. When they get into the club on Friday night and they hang out with the retirees and they drink beers and they talk about the old days, the brown shoe days, they help to continue that mythology. That's what they like. They don't want to be seen as going against the grain of that beloved right stuff kind of culture. The other thing considers the Air Force Times, being like any other media outlet, has their agenda. And their agenda is very much along the lines of, if they see a sufficient proportion of women in pilot training, well, then they consider it to be mission accomplished. Again, I think that's wrong-headed. The focus here is to get the best pilots. If the best pilots happen to be 99% women, by God, let's get the best pilots. If it happens to be 1% women, then let's get the best pilots. You have to focus on the objective reality, because what these people do is vitally important to our nation. Other concerns don't really factor in here. These are the people on the front lines. They're on the tip of the spear. They're the ones who are going to be protecting the homeland from the bad guys. They need to be the best. Whatever that best look like. If it turns out that the very best fighter pilots in the world are Filipino midgets who are transgendered, well, go crank up the uniform factories and start making some alterations, because that's what we need. But it would really help if the leadership in the Air Force took the job seriously enough to stop simply arguing over budgetary matters and start thinking about the type of fighter and warrior that we're producing out of the ranks here. In this case, I certainly feel as though, because of the bro culture, we are not seeing the full potential of females and probably racial minorities in pilot training. They don't go deep on the latter subject, but it seems as though they imply the bro culture is an obstacle there as well. This is not World War II. We don't need to have the Tuskegee Airmen. What we need to do is have a better way of objectively evaluating how these folks do. And part of the problem is that in the Air Force, your instructor pilot really counts for everything. They're the one that are up in the aircraft with you, observing what you do. It may be a better plan to consider, in this technical age here, a more objective way of evaluating how these folks actually do. And that's, we know what the telemetry is on the controls in the aircraft. We know what the mission profile is. We should be able to objectively evaluate how they fulfill that profile and leave the instructor pilot's commentary to the more subjective part of it, which should, in my opinion, be a minority of the points scored in any such enterprise. I want to know if they can fly the bloody aircraft, first and foremost. Secondarily, once you can fly the aircraft, what's your potential? What's your aptitude for being able to do something with it in a combat situation? That's really all I, as a taxpayer, would need to know out of this process. And I think if they get into a more objective evaluation training model, these folks would have less subjective authority over these students. We get a better telemetry on how they're doing, and we can produce better pilots in the future. Again, assuming that we're here to produce better pilots, and we're not here to produce future generals of the Air Force, which is another problem that this system has. There's too much stress being put onto what you're going to be in 30 years instead of focusing on what are you today and can you help us if the balloon goes up. Another long and vexing conundrum for us to unpack culturally. The net of it, I think, is that I would not expect significant improvement in AETC. I would expect some continued scandals because I don't think they're really addressing the culture rot that's at the heart of this particular issue. And certainly for those students to go through who are deemed to be outsiders, who have such a tough row to hoe, and whose patriotism and dedication is such that they continue to push through it, well, my hats are off to you. Being a square peg in a round hole is no fun, but through perseverance, you may yet get to fulfill your dream once the culture finally catches up with the purpose of the organization. Have a terrific day.